March 7th is a 4-star ice preservation character, often referred to as the mascot or favorite child of Honkai Star Rail, but I beg to differ. March 7th was a character for many players that arguably still has tons of value for the PvE side of the game, due to her mechanics and ability to cheese various contents the game has to offer. Nowadays, you can find her amongst the lowest tier of the characters in the game, despite having a kit that is amazing and unique from the rest of the cast. She really is the most underrated character in the game. Sadly, this held true until the addition of the latest Memories of Chaos, which has proven that she'll only get worse as time goes on. In the early game, March was amazing, and it really did help with the fact that you have access to her within moments of picking your MC. In the early game, you had no way of dishing out enough damage to avoid taking damage like nowadays, and considering there was no other defensive option with as immediate accessibility, she was a character that most players would find themselves using. March still would be used mostly by those that absolutely love the character or wanted to complete the game without rolling in the gacha. The reason why this is important is because even though she would also be free just like March, at launch Natasha was a featured 4-star on the rate-up banner. Chances are for those that were rerolling, you obtained Natasha in the process or ended up getting both Bailu and Gepard in the process. So despite being given for free, March finding herself in these circumstances, she would have the lowest utilization amongst all the other defensive options in the early game. To play devil's advocate here, rerolling in Honkai Star Rail took an absurd amount of time, but most players would realize that taking the time to kickstart their account would prove valuable once they reached the late game where they needed 2 instead of 1 defensive option. It was also important to note that even though Preservation and Abundance both had the job of keeping the team healthy, most players would prefer to use an Abundance character instead. Despite there being in-game statues to heal your characters, your team's health will be whittled down as you tackled more and more fights with March and Gepard on the team. All these circumstances meant March never had a time within the early game of Honkai Star Rail where she was best in slot, or so we thought. There would be a 5-star physical powerhouse that would not only take the community by storm, but also prove to have one-to-one synergy with March. Now while Clara and March nowadays is deemed to have anti-synergy with one another, what's important to note is much like Genshin Impact in the early game, energy wasn't as frequent. This combination meant that you could consistently get more counterattacks from Clara, increasing the damage of the character, but there would prove to be one issue. You had to hold your ultimate on March. Freezing enemies in AoE was a specialty of March, but due to the way Clara worked as a character, you would essentially be negating half the kit of March just to have synergy with Clara. This duo wouldn't hold up as well with the later release of a particular 4-star Abundance character, but this was really a lack of options at the time more than anything else. Aside from the synergies with Clara, March would have no best in slot teams, which meant to every other defensive option character she was a side grade. Having a cleanse on elemental skill was very nice, but for the team she was present in, it was only valuable for her team containing Clara. March would then go on to be a character that suffered from even less usage, as the general player base would not only begin to increase their roster, but also realize that Clara teams wasn't as optimal into the mid to late game where there was more AoE and enemies had more hit points. March's usage would drop pretty harshly, as one of her best selling points was also the best of another character. Now with the part of her kit that wasn't utilized, there would be synergy with another ice character to weakness break enemies more often, which in combination with the freeze in March's ultimate meant you could use her as the sole defensive option if the contents called for it. But this was a playstyle that many people were just not willing to give a try. Could you honestly blame the average player when using Bailu and Gepard is a lot more comfy and auto-friendly? On the topic of Gepard, he essentially could do everything that March did but better. He had AoE shielding lasting 3 turns, a freeze on an elemental skill, an even higher personal taunt value, and a self-revive with AoE shield after his revival. Compared to March, Gepard would turn the hardest contents to easy mode. Now while still overshadowed in most teams, March did still have amazing synergy and damage over time teams with the release of Kafka, thanks to the free synergy with dots. If you froze an enemy and they were to take their turn, any dot effect would proc on their turn and their action would be delayed from the freeze effect. That enemy would then take their turn again, essentially having an extra proc of the dots for free, which helped with dishing out more damage and keeping the team healthier. This synergy would become even more prominent following the release of Ruan Mei. Despite Gepard also having a freeze, March was the only one out of the two that had an area effect attached to the freeze. Most players would however overlook this synergy altogether because not only was dot niche at the time, compared to hyper carry, most players still didn't like the lessened comfortability that March gave compared to the better defensive options at the time. This meant you had to build a March from scratch and give her tons of effect hit rate, which just wasn't optimal for many players in their tight resources at the time. Even nowadays, where players have arguably more resources to invest into March, why go through the hassle? After the release of Kafka, March has less and less usage as there would be constant releases on other defensive options that would present more value for the team, and her limitations as a 4-star begin to show. After the release of Fu Xuan, virtually no one would use March. Alongside Fu Xuan will be the 4-star abundance we talked about in the beginning of the video. The fate of Natasha would be the same fate of March. The partial synergy of March and Clara would be replaced completely following the release of Lynx, whom just like March, had a way of giving increased taunt value to an ally. Lynx's elemental skill not only gave Clara more increased taunt, it also gave increased HP, heal over time, and an attack boost with Eidolons. Lynx also had more cleansing capabilities, and again provided heals which was more comfy for the average player. Fast forward to patch 1.6 and Lynx would end up being given for free, which makes March even less enticing into the endgame. This fate for March was only inevitable, because a free character could only take you so far before they start to feel obsolete compared to pricier gacha options. There would be one thing that Hoyoverse would do to make the endgame not revolve around Memories of Chaos, and this update to the beloved existing content in Honkai Star Rail was one of the best things that could have happened for March. Simulated Universe is a roguelike game mode that revolves around picking up various buffs as you make your way into the final stage of the game mode. Amongst those buffs would be a synergy with March that was completely unforeseen. Swarm Disaster would release, which was an even harder version of Simulated Universe. Enemies had more hit points, would hit your characters harder, most of the time one-shot you, and punished you if your RNG was bad on that particular run in the game mode. March alongside Pela and Herta would have a ton of toughness breaking in the form of ice, but depending on the buffs you could pick up in the Remembrance path, would allow you to have 100% freeze uptime on the enemies, taking 0 damage, and would also deal a ton of damage to those enemies that were frozen based on the buffs you had in the Remembrance path. Considering this game mode was one and done, not repeatable like Memories of Chaos, the inevitable would only be delayed from March, because sadly her kit was still underwhelming compared to the massive amount of defensive options at the time. Following the release of Ruan Mei, March would have a lot of extra synergy against enemies that are weak to ice, but also in dot teams that utilize Ruan Mei. As someone who used these two together, I can say for certain the synergy is there, but the reality of the situation is that Gepard is honestly better in that very same team, which brings us back to a point iterated earlier in the video. March doesn't have any best in slot team. She feels much like Natasha in that regard. These grim days for March would not only feel like an eternity, but also become a lot more worse in present day Star Rail. With the latest Memories of Chaos update in 2.0, there would be one enemy that completely notifies March as a character. Not only does the same enemy has a ton of hit points and toughness HP, when you take the best part of a character's kit and make it render useless in any content, their viability falls off a cliff, which at this point was already where March stood in the meta, but kicked them while they're down, I guess. So there you have it. I honestly like having March as a character to use when the situation previously called for it, because she has a unique way of keeping the team healthy versus other characters. Sadly, she just feels like an actual 4-star, much like Natasha. Expect to see more decreased usage for characters like this as we go further and further into the game. March is now a relic of the past. Thank you for watching, and have a nice rest of your day. Peace.